I think that, great. We can go through, you can take a little bit of time, but not too much time in presenting yourself. And I think that we can just go down the participants list. I can read people's names and say who it is. And just you can take 30 seconds or maybe up to a minute and a half. And then we'll go into the presentations. The presentations will be brief also, and then we'll go into the discussion. So I'm gonna go down here. Christian Munoz is the first one on my list.
Yes. Hello, good evening, good morning. I'm Christian Munoz. I work in the Institute of Marine Research as a senior engineer. 100% time for the ER Management Program, which is a program funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and executed with FAO. I am also part of the steering group of OBPS. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Sandra, Antonio. I'm going to stop. If you want to come back, Sandra, that's fine. Abby Benson.
Hey everyone, I work for the U.S. Geological Survey. I'm the node manager for OBIS USA and GBEF US. Thanks.
Thank you. Christina Pavludi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm a postdoc researcher at the George Washington University. In my previous position, I was deeply involved in marine conservation, and I'm also a member of the task group of OBPS on eDNA and omics. And yeah, looking forward in the discussion.
Thank you. Danny Kincaid.
Thanks, Frank. I am both a director and a PI of ecological data repository, a marine ecological data repository called BecoDemo. So I'm here primarily in listen mode. BecoDemo curates and manages a wide gamut of biological observations. And so I'm interested in the session. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny. Douglas Rao.
I am research scientist with NOAA's NCEI's Crawford Institute at Satellite and Persistence Studies and in Asheville.
Thank you. And Douglas is one of the co-conveners of this session. So thank you very much, Doug. Esa Salazar. Elsa, we cannot hear you. Okay, we can come back. Emmett.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emmett Duffy. I'm Director of Smithsonian Institution's Marine Geo Program, which is a global research network that's focused on biodiversity and resilience in nearshore ecosystems. I work closely with the MBON and Goose folks and Marine Life 2030.
Thank you. George Cummings.
Thanks, Frank. So George Cummings, Austin, Texas, diver, 30 years, biochemist, and now spokesperson for the Mesoamerican SDGs 30 Coalition for the North Atlantic Ocean. And I'm also honored, humbled to be here with so many legends of the ocean.
Thank you, George. Henry Rule.
Hi there. Yeah, so I'm Henry Rule, the Central and Northern California Ocean Observing System Director, and I'm in Moss Landing, California, and based at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. So I think the two most relevant programs that I've been working on are Marine Life 2030 in relation to the MBON program and the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy as well. And so in the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy piece, there's some work ongoing for essential ocean variables across physics, biogeochemistry, and the bioeco variables. And so for the bioeco category, we're working mainly on sponges, corals, and invertebrates. And so we're at various stages of trying to evolve the specification documentation that goes with those and the maturity of the UOB, depending on, there's various stages depending on which one we're talking about, but this will include, there's a sponge meeting this week, actually happening now, an international sponge meeting where some of the folks that are involved are attending. And then there's also a choral meeting next year where we're going to hopefully have a breakout session on the EOB topic to help socialize the concept and advance it. And there's also some work ongoing with the data stream planning, and so that brings in the co-design concept. So this data stream planning, I think, is a nice way to sort of document co-design, the results of co-design. How does data get from A to B, and how does it get modified to best suit specific users of that information? So that's something we're in training into those EOB concepts as well. And then lastly, there's a session on Thursday. I can put a link in the chat for those that are interested. There's a session on Thursday that Deuce is hosting on low-cost sensors. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Henry. Jay Perlman.
Hello, everyone. I'm here in a number of roles. One is the co-chair of the Ocean Best Practice Systems and support for Frank in the workshop. I'm also the co-lead of the decade-endorsed Ocean Practices program, and that's of interest here. And then finally, I think that the work we're doing here is very relevant to the coasts, and so should be engaged in Coast Predict, which I'm a focus area lead for. Thank you.
Thank you. John Pye.
Hi, I'm John Pye. I'm Director of Data Operations for the Ocean Tracking Network. We're mainly an infrastructure platform for acoustically tracked animals globally. We also support communities regionally and locally who are doing the same sort of work and looking to aggregate their data and support them both with equipment, but also with data management services. So I'm here to find out just how we fit into the program. We've been working with MBON for some time now, and most recently on the BioTrack initiative, which is very exciting. But we are looking for ways to which we plug more directly into these other programs for data aggregation and how to make ourselves useful.
Great. Thank you for being here. May Reid.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maria O'Donovan. I'm based in Ireland. I work remotely with the Global Ocean Observing System, which is part of IOC UNESCO. And I'll be talking a bit about the GOOS Ocean Decade program on co-design. My role with GOOS is supporting the 3 GOOS Ocean Decade programs. So that includes Coast Predict, Observing Together, and Ocean Observing Co-Design.
Thank you. Maria Gamboa. Okay, we'll skip Maria Gamboa and we'll go to Maria Grigorato.
Yes, hello everyone. It's really nice being here today. My name is Maria Grigorato and I'm a science officer at Mercator Ocean International in France. And I'm working on the G7 initiative for the future of the oceans and the sea. And I'm really excited to be here and hear about your thoughts on Frank's question, how we're gonna go beyond the problem and have some coordination among the Ocean Decade actions for marine life, because this is something that we care a lot and we want to make some suggestions for the G7 initiative. So you might hear back from me after this meeting, like in the following days or weeks around that topic.
Thank you for being here, Maria. Pierluigi Buttigieg.
He just mentioned in the chat that he can't talk, but he linked out to his ORCID details. So.
Okay, very good. Raisa.
Okay, yeah, so I'm Raisa Maya. I am one of the co-founders of OBON, the Ocean Biomolecular Observing Network, which is a UN Ocean Decade program. And I'm co-leading the data and information strategy on that side. I'm also involved in a project under OBON, which is focused on how we share the methodologies and which is a maturation of the omics eDNA
task group under the OBPS that Christina also mentioned previously. And then further, I'm a co-founder of the OMIG BON, so an OMIG Biodiversity Observation Network under GeoBON. And on that side, of course, also linking with MBON and the other bonds that are part of GeoBON. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Raisa. Sam Dupont.
Hello, everybody. So Sam Dupont, University of Gothenburg in Sweden. So I'm here as one of the members together with Frank, of the ORS program for Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability. And we are also sharing a really strong co-design aspects together with some biological monitoring. Thank you.
Thank you. Sofia Nativi. Okay, Sophia, we will skip you and go to Steve Bograt.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Hello, everyone. I'm an oceanographer at NOAA Fisheries in Monterey, California, and I'm representing a couple of programs here today. One is SmartNet, which is a program jointly sponsored by ICES and Pisces, which aims to establish global knowledge networks around the climate fisheries nexus. And also the SUPREME program, which aims to advance global capacity sharing around marine ecosystem predictability and ecosystem management. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. Yana Samuel. Well, there are several people that were not introduced either because they didn't respond, or I don't know if they have issues with the microphone. Is there anybody that would like to jump in and introduce themselves before we move on? Okay. I hope that those of you that were not introduced, that you can jump into the conversation later on. I'm Frank Mueller-Karger at the University of South Florida, and I'm also one of the co-leads of the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, or MBON, and the Marine Life 2030 Ocean Decade Program. And what I'd like to do now is invite two speakers. One is going to be Mayreed O'Donovan, and the other one is going to be Emmett Duffy. And let's start with Mayreed to tell us about the Goose co-design effort.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Let me just share my screen. Do you see this okay?
Yep, works good.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'm presenting on behalf of the GOOS program, Ocean Observing Co-Design. The co-chairs of the program are Sabrina Speich and David Legler. And there's leadership also from Emma Heslop at GOOS. And then the role I have with the program is as support. And I mentioned earlier that I'm working across the other GOOS Ocean Decade programs as well. So some of you may be familiar with the overview that I'm going to present, because I recognize some of the names. We had a workshop earlier in the year, and I recognize that some people were at that workshop. But in any case, I'm just going to kind of give a general overview of the program, just to give you context of how co-design is being approached in terms of observing system design. So the overall ambition is to develop very user-focused co-design processes, and through the program to develop best practices for co-design. And these will be kind of continuous and iterative, and with the overall objective of evolving an integrated and responsive ocean observing system. So there'll be tools for evaluation and iterative feedback. And just to give an overview of the objectives, ultimately the co-design processes will provide information in terms of how investment can be targeted for optimal results from an observing system. The second of the objectives here is about making the information more accessible and impactful. And of course, that's where the end user engagement is really important to understand what information and knowledge is actually required by different users. The output will be in the form of system diagnostics and tools and this reporting capability so that the system can be continuously evaluated to ensure that it's delivering fit for purpose information. And again, relating that to the user requirements and needs. And then the final of the objectives here is about developing capacity and infrastructure that can be, scaled at a global scale for the global observing system. And these kind of link the program benefits, I guess, kind of link to the objectives. Relating to having better knowledge so that variability and current ocean health can be tracked. It also links to warning systems in terms of predictions. The management of ocean resources, which I guess is particularly relevant to this group and to the Marine Life Exemplar project. And then also empowering, so kind of directly linking the observations to societal needs and providing, again, the information that's of use to end users. And then this sort of societal benefit, demonstration of the societal benefit, we hope will incentivize investment. And we had an interesting part of the workshop earlier in the year about the value of ocean observations, some economic assessment of that. And then also a key part, I'll mention this again later, is just about integrating along the value chain, the whole value chain of observations from implementers to users. So the approach that the Ocean Observing Co-Design program is taking is to look at a first set of exemplars around specific use areas. And so the Marine Life 2030 exemplar projects is one of these. And the idea is to focus on these specific use areas and use these as a way to develop the co-design processes and to develop best practice for co-design. And within each of these exemplar project areas, there's a need to give visibility to user needs. So this is the first set of 6 that are in development so far, and these were a focus of the workshop that we held in June. We had specific sessions to begin to develop these, and it's great that this evening session is being used to further work on the Marine Life 2030, the shape of that project. And then just in terms of how these exemplars work, so the top statement here just again kind of relates to co-design as the program sees it, and some of these points were discussed in the workshop that we had earlier in the year in terms of existing experiences and learnings from other co-design examples in other sectors. But key elements of developing the exemplars would be to focus on specific user groups. And one of the exercises that has been started already, and that's kind of been progressing in the last weeks and months even, is to do a mapping of the value chain as a basis to start identifying users and connections to users or lack of connections to users, identify services or lack of services, and so on. And then this will help to elevate the collaboration between existing elements of the value chain, and then also identify elements that are missing and in need of development. And then the next of these steps kind of relates back to the earlier objectives in terms of co-developing the observing system design in order to better understand return on investment and inform investment. And then also to develop recommendations for addressing gaps in the value chain. So this is this first block of points is relating to how the exemplars will develop, and then these will contribute to the development of best practices through the program. And then ultimately, these best practices need to be implemented and integrated into GOOs in the longer term and into the infrastructure, so that there's this continuous tracking and evaluation of the observing system and provision of recommendations. So that's kind of a generic overview of how it's envisaged that the exemplars will be developed and implemented. And what I thought would be good as well is just to kind of note some of the key learnings from the workshop in June. We had some really good discussions about co-design and learnings from previous experiences, and then also challenges to co-design. And so I thought it'd be useful to highlight some of these. One of the big takeaways from the workshop was just a discussion around resourcing co-design processes and the fact that this takes time, especially for effective engagement with users, so that users are being listened to and truly involved in the process. And this resourcing question kind of links, or resourcing issue links to the second point about the need for kind of a paradigm shift away from conventional measures of scientific success. So acknowledging the time and resources that are needed for the co-design process, and not just focusing on, kind of traditional or conventional scientific output. The other thing, which relates to what I mentioned earlier about the economic value of ocean observations. So the co-design needs to demonstrate benefits to society in terms of the information. And one of the things that we discussed in the workshop was the fact that putting an economic value on that can be very useful. And then the last of these are, I guess, kind of self-explanatory in terms of optimizing observations to address the user needs as part of the observing system. And then again, ensuring that there's collaboration across the entire value chain. And I expect we may talk a bit more about the value chain later, Frank, I'm not sure, just in relation to the value chain that's being developed for Marine Life 2030 exemplar. So that's the last of my slides. I want to maybe offer Frank a chance to say something if you have anything to add.
No, I appreciate that, Mayreed. I wonder if other people have questions, and either you can ask questions now, or we can ask questions of Mayreed later on exactly how GOOs can support all of us in this process. No questions? Jay is asking if we can allow for a moment of a picture of all the attendees. He's the expert doing this. So, Jay, you're welcome to exercise your magic and taking the picture of the group. Right now we have Mayreed pinned, but I think that you would have to unpin yourself.
Great. If everybody can turn on your cameras, just give us a moment with your video on, and we'll do that. And then what would be really nice is I'll take a second one, and you can wave at me and we're good. So give me a second and I'll be ready with you. Everybody have their camera on that has the capability? Give everybody just a minute. Okay, That's super. And I guess we can smile if we're enjoying this. I don't know. You can make up your minds. And I'll do one more, and that'll be it. Great, folks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. What if there are no questions right now for Mayreed? I hope that there will be some, because I think Goose is structured. Of course, they're focused on co-design for ocean observing, but I think this has to attach to everything that we do and linking to the actual users. So what I'd like to do, Maria Grigoratu.
I think Pierre was first, so Pierre, you can go.
No, go ahead. I talk too much.
Okay. Well, just maybe a question I have is how Goose found the exercise, like the workshop you had in June, about like the co-design actions, and maybe if you can share in a very like abstract way some updates on that and what are the next steps.
The next steps from the workshop are really focused on these 6 exemplars. So we had some initial recommendations from the workshop in terms of developing the exemplars, and that's what we've been working on over the past months and continuing to work on. So what we're doing at the moment is each of the exemplars are developing a project kind of outline proposal over sort of 3 phases. So the first involves mapping the value chain and identifying, I mentioned that in the presentation, identifying the users and the different elements of the value chain and where there are already gaps identified. And then with these proposals, our plan is later in November and early December to start engaging supporters for the exemplar, for the co-design exemplars. So these may be supporters in terms of funding, or also, for example, other programs through the Ocean Decade Alliance, the GOOS networks, and other components. So all kind of the actors along the value chain, we want to present the projects to them and really start getting commitments and involvement to take the exemplars forward. So I think that's the plan for tonight, is to look at the Marine Life 2030 project outline in terms of how that proposal can be put forward.
Maybe there's a request to share the slides, and maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I'll do a PDF of them and I'll send them.
Or, yeah, I mean, you can actually probably paste them into the notes document if you take the, highlight them and just paste them into the Google Doc. That would be good. So, Maria, well, maybe Pierluigi, if you wanted to. I didn't see your hand up, so I didn't notice that. But please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I attended that co-design workshop, and we're familiar with the narrative, right? But how do we do the actual work now? So the requirements, the user requirements, where are they? When we talk about these sort of things, or the value chain, whose value chain? Where are they? Because we have projects right now which are developing material stuff. We have timelines in Europe which we have to meet, but we don't know how to align to, let's say, the GOOS process. We've been to the workshops, but there's still a very high level. There's still the narrative, so to speak. So what do we actually do? Where are the user requirements being listed or whatever, so that we can react and at least align some of our capacities to make sure that we're heading in the same direction?
Yeah, of course, that is exactly the crux of the whole process, Pierluigi. So the way that I have to confess, I'm way behind on this whole thing, because the activity that we're planning on with the GOOS co-design after the workshop, it's really not just a Marine Life 2030 exemplar, it's really a Marine Life exemplar where I would like to involve people that are not exactly in the middle of Marine Life 2030 at the moment. That's why you're all here. So that the way that I scoped it, and I don't remember, Pierluigi, if you were part of the Marine Life co-design exemplar session in the workshop, the way that we ended up thinking that an exemplar could be prepared is having a leitmotif of the 30 by 30, but working at different scales. So if we, and there were some activities that we thought could be sort of like the seminal activities at the local level. One was a group in Costa Rica that is a cooperative that works locally with fishermen, and they're sort of pinned between the traditional uses of their part of the ocean and the government of Costa Rica that is implementing marine protected areas as a contribution to 30 by 30, but the fishermen were not necessarily consulted. And so it's a little bit of a political issue, and yet there is a way to move forward. The government is asking the fishermen to stand up a scientific process for observing the resources. Okay, so we think that there may be a local exemplar there within this value chain, or not value chain, but the leitmotif of 30 by 30 of how do you reach global 30% protection by local contributions and yet engage the stakeholders in the process. Another one, and this is why I asked Emmett Duffy to provide a little bit of a talk, is there are a lot of people that are looking at seagrasses as areas that should be conserved or protected. And there's quite a bit of people that are looking at seagrasses, but as you can imagine, there's a little bit of disarray in the number of methods, the way that people look at the data, how to use the EOV concept to organize this community a little bit better, and then how do you apply that for to come up with a marine protected or conserved area. And so the other local project is in Malaysia. This is just a local project. There are many, and that's why I'd like to see what else we can include. But Malaysia is about to propose an MPA focused on a seagrass area, and they'd like to know how can they organize the data collection process to understand what do they protect, and then do they understand whether the protection is or the conservation is effective or not. And so I wanted to ask Emmett if he could give us an overview of how he's developing the EOV specifications so that it can be useful for that process. Then once he does that, we get into the discussion, Pierluigi, how do we link all of these local processes and efforts to conserve into something that may be more regional. And we've talked to all of the MBON projects have some link or another to the ocean tracking network and to the animal tracking network. And so that is why OTN is here also. We're thinking that at a regional level, we could also look at some corridors of animal movement that can be mapped against jurisdictions or ocean uses as an example or an exemplar of regional protection or conservation. And then the idea is having this, as much as we can, working with groups like OBIS, and that's more of an academic exercise. Can we use what exists in terms of the data that is already on the books and overlay that on marine areas? And some people have done that already. So there's actually a few publications that have done that. And then that can be perhaps mapping that against what is being done at a local and regional level to see if it fits or understand how we can move forward in this co-design. So the co-design audience at the global level may be the CBD as they're developing these, or the nations that the parties to the CBD. So, but all of these players, all these stakeholders have to be engaged by us. Okay? We are the ones that need to engage them, or working with community-based organizations or NGOs. And so that's going to take a long time. But I think that connection to the user is where we, as ocean observers, have not yet met the goal. I don't know if that answers Pierluigi, or do we go into Emmet's presentation?
It provides information. I'll try to rephrase it in the chat, but let's move on.
Okay, thank you. Emmet, so maybe you can tell us where you are with the seagrass EOV and how, and may perhaps see how it could connect to an effort like the one that we're talking about in Malaysia or other places.
Sure, I will share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Yes, I hope so. Sorry, one
Yes.
thing here. Right. Are you seeing the other slides on the side there, or is that the full screen?
We see your editing mode.
Oh dear. Okay. All right. I'll just do this without a net then. So thanks everyone for joining us. So what I'd like to talk about is an example of the seagrass essential ocean variable that I think is relevant here. So for the last several years, we have been working on how to develop and operationalize the essential ocean variable concept for seagrass cover and composition, which, as you know, is one of a small-ish numbers of biological EOVs that Goose has come up with. So I'd like to give you a little bit of update on where we are in that process. So this has been supported by a working group grant from, how do I change this thing? There we go. From SCORE, the Scientific Committee for Oceanic Research, and we're grateful to them, which was led by myself and some folks from the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. We have a large number of partners who have participated in the virtual working groups over the last couple of years. This will be an experience familiar to many of you, that this started right about the time of the beginning of the pandemic. So we've only recently had our first in-person meeting in August. But anyway, the point was to try to bring together the different approaches that have been used to observe seagrass extent and abundance, cover and composition in a way that can contribute to a coherent global picture. So this gets to several of the questions that we were just talking about, the user requirements, what they are, how you operationalize this, what does it mean when you get down to the level of people actually in the water collecting data. So these are some of our partners. Some have contributed more than others, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So coordinating global research assessment of seagrass systems, which comes out as seagrass or sea-grass. It turns out to be a somewhat confusing acronym. But anyway, this is the SCORE group that has really brought us together, and we've been able to make progress on this. So the vision of this group, the SCORE group, has been tightly connected to operationalizing the seagrass EOV, and a lot of that has to do with best practices for data, as we're talking about here. So it is a rigorous dynamic picture of global seagrass status and trends that is built up from the primarily local observations that happen, that are being collected for seagrasses. And so that sort of connects to the second part of the vision, which is a global community of practice that stewards that data and that picture for the public good. And I think it's interesting to point out here that seagrasses and other nearshore biogenic habitats like coral reefs, for example, are quite distinct in many ways from the sorts of oceanographic variables that the Global Ocean Observing System has really worked with over the decades and pioneered. These systems are different in that because they're close to shore, they are familiar to people living in coastal communities, and many of the observations are actually done locally by people that are concerned about them for their own reasons. So it would be interesting to discuss with this group. It seems to me that this is a case where the user needs come up sort of organically from the people that are already doing this work. And so we can come back to that in a moment. So how did we attempt to achieve this vision, or at least advance towards it? The group, the SCORE group, had four main components of our mission. I won't go into detail about this, but basically you can see the data schema is at the top of this. They're a little bit out of order. Best practices is another one. So in essence, what we wanted to do was to say, what is the essential ocean variable actually mean in the field and for people who are using it? What do you actually need to measure? What are the key subvariables or components that one needs to measure to provide valuable data? And so that involved developing, first of all, the specification sheet for the seagrass EOV, and then developing, we have here a handbook of standard protocols under best practices on the bottom here. We are not there yet with the handbook of standard protocols, but we have collated a number of those. And what we're interested in doing and working on is figuring out how to make the data that come from those protocols interoperable with one another. What are the key subvariables? What are the minimum and then the recommended ways of measuring those variables so that you can actually integrate them across space and time. Going back up to the top for data schema here, the second component of that's really critical, of course, is having that data collected, collated in a format that allows it to be submitted in public repositories, primarily OBIS is who we're working with now, but also BICO-DEMO, for example. And to that end, in the working group, we had Abby Benson, who's on the call, I believe now, and Frank, we're both in this working group, and we've worked closely with OBIS on this. So those are the components that I think are most relevant to this best practices workshop. Obviously, for many of the people who are actually collecting these data, the ultimate goal is scientific understanding or better tracking of local environments. So data synthesis is important. We have a group working on that. And then the community of practice, which is intended on socializing these ideas about best practices and data schema in two directions. So it comes back to the code design that Mayreed was talking about. That is, what are the incentives for people to actually work together and provide data that they have collected in a format that is usable by others, and also how by working with people who need the data and are using it, how does that help us do this job better? So I'll talk a little bit about each of those, or at least two of them. So as I mentioned, we had our first in-person meeting just a couple months ago in August. We took advantage of the International Seagrass Biology Workshop, which is done every 2 years and was held in Annapolis, Maryland in August, which gave us a great opportunity to interact with a very large part of the global seagrass community. And then we added a 2-day workshop onto ISBW at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center to work specifically on the sea-grass mission, including best practices in ocean, and data schema. So we had 16 participants from 6 countries, most in person, a few online. And importantly, I think we also had officers of the World Seagrass Association with us, and several of us also sit on the Goose BioEco panel. So we had a good connection to the larger community of seagrass researchers and conservation. So the way we have approached this is basically to say, a key goal of this group is to complete the GOOSE specification sheet for the essential ocean variables, seagrass cover, and composition. I will say that this was a little more challenging than we originally anticipated. Several of you on the call have been working on these for various EOVs, but I think that we are very close to complete. So we farmed this out. We had a working group within Sea-Grass that focused on the best practices. This was led by Len McKenzie and Chris Rolfsema in Australia for the in situ and the remote sensing portions of this, respectively. Again, got the broad community input and paired this with the data schema, which I'll show momentarily. I think we're almost complete on this. So for the data schema, this was originally pioneered by Lauren Weatherden of WCMC, and then Sarah Pruckner also. Both of them have moved on to other things now. But basically what we're trying to do is find a way of connecting the main sort of seagrass data formats that are being collected in sort of global monitoring programs in a way that connects them up to, that can convert them into a form that is Darwin Core compliant and that can be uploaded to OBIS. And I can go into that more if you'd like. I won't go into the details right now. So that's simply a spreadsheet, and we hope to have an R script also that will make that connection. We've started doing that with some of the data formats. And finally, I'll mention that for most of the people who are collecting these data, the ultimate goal is scientific understanding. And so an incentive for working within this group was doing a data synthesis of everything that we could get our hands on. And what we've ended up, the direction we've gone is comparing time series on aerial extent that's taken from remote sensing versus percent cover that is happening in situ. This is being led by Johannes Krause, who is a postdoc at Florida International University with Jim Forkran. We were able to find 5 regions where there are good time series for both the remote and the in situ, and that MS is in progress. And I will just leave it there, and thank you for your attention. Happy to answer questions.
Yeah, Emmett, just as you think about how a group like in Malaysia could use this to inform the government to plan and then monitor for the success of an NPA.
Yes, so you know, a big part of the interest, as I think this group knows well, in seagrasses is for assessment of blue carbon, and particularly by countries who are interested in quantifying their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Accord. And so that provides part of the motivation. There are also, of course, fisheries, nurseries, and coastal protection elements to the needs. But in terms of how to do that, what we're trying to provide is a relatively simple way of quantifying seagrass. That's it. So for example, if you are interested in a marine protected area and you want to know what is the relative distribution of coral reef habitat, seagrass, and so on, where we are aiming to go, and I think in the relatively near future, is to say, okay, here are what the community considers the best practices for understanding aerial extent over hectares, hundreds of hectares of seagrass meadows on the one hand, and also that would be the seagrass cover or extent, and also the composition or quality of the habitat, if you will, the abundance, the species composition. Does that answer your question, Frank?
Yeah, sort of. That goes into something that I have in the notes here on how we connect, where does the rubber hit the road? Okay, and I think that maybe we can open this for discussion, but let me say a couple things, maybe take 2 minutes to put things in context of what we're talking about, the kind of thing that Pierluigi just suggested. And the way that I have experienced this whole process is that it's going to be long, it's going to take time, and it's going to be up to us. Okay, I think that it's not going to be like Goose finding the stakeholders for us and then connecting us with the stakeholders. I think it's going to be up to us at every level of organization. And the three levels that I'm talking about is, again, local, regional, and global. And there are different stakeholders at each one of these, and the science community being one of the stakeholders. But the actual people that make policy and make decisions, we have to find a way to connect with them, because we keep talking about it and it doesn't happen. So one of the groups that is organizing stakeholders is the Convention for Biological Diversity. And so I have here these science briefs on 2 targets that are part of what they call the Global Biodiversity Framework, or that the Convention on Biological Diversity is planning for the post-2020 effort. So they are going to have their conference on the parties in December. There's a lot of discussion on what to define as a target, what to define as indicators, and a lot of it is going to be up to us to make these things, these targets and these indicators, especially the indicators, tractable for countries to agree to do, or they won't do it. Okay, so this is why I think that we need to work at the local level with small groups, with people that are embedded in the community, and see what they can do to solve their needs, or all of this is going to be so academic that nobody's going to care. So there are specific targets that are being talked about as part of this global biodiversity framework that are important, and they connect to the essential ocean variables. One is cover or extent, and there's a little bit of confusion on exactly how they use cover in their language. But specifically, for example, for seagrasses, coral reefs, mangroves, there is a lot of talk about cover, and they want to protect 30% of the cover in the global ocean or on land. But specifically to in the ocean, we can tie that to EOVs. The EOVs are, it has cover in the name. So seagrass cover and diversity, or is one way to think about it. The other one is target 8 in this global biodiversity framework, which is about climate change impacts. And that has to do a lot with resilience and vulnerability, and how people benefit from these ecosystem services. So I think that there's places where we can tie in, but there's no way of escaping that we have to work with these communities. And so part of the Goose co-design process, and Mayreed can tell me where they are on this, is to find funding, because that's the elephant in the room. Is to do this, you have to meet with people, you have to organize workshops, and you have to do the co-design process, and that is going to take money. So Goose is proposing to shop around some of these ideas on co-design that we need to lay out in a proposal to Goose, to some of the sponsors of stakeholder process. So they are the process is not to actually do the observations and come up with a solution, but the co-design process is to meet with stakeholders. So go way back to square one, to the beginning of the process, and redo the way that we do science, and do it jointly with these communities. And so I don't know, Mayreed, if you want to tell us how you're planning to organize this, and how can these different groups here come together, and what we're talking about.
Yeah, so the first step for this is the meetings that we are starting to organize the end of November, start of December, to put these proposals, basically to pitch these proposals to different organizations that might support, either through working with us, like the GRAs, the different components of GOOS, and then also, yeah, the funding question. So we need to pitch it to potential funders. Some of those will be existing observing system funders. We're hoping that we can leverage the Ocean Decade because co-design is has been highlighted as a major need for the ocean decade. So yeah, that's the first step for that, and that's why these projects, these exemplar project proposals are important, so that we have something to put on the table, and we have an outline in terms of what is being proposed. And like I was mentioning, that value chain mapping and an idea of who the end users, stakeholders are, and what gaps there are also in the value chain.
Yes, so let me open the floor for other ideas, suggestions. I requested that if people are interested in following up with me on that proposal, which I have not done, I only have a half-baked piece of text, so I need to mature it. Please put a star, an asterisk next to your name, or write specifically into the notes that you want to participate. So the idea that I have, which may be a harebrained idea, but and this is something that I'd like to get some feedback on, is to write the proposal as a exemplar that has several geographic levels of focus. And so there are many exemplars. My sense, may read, is that we could present this to sponsors and they could chunk it. They can take one. I don't think anybody's going to fund the whole thing, but they could take an example, let's say seagrass MPA in Malaysia, which, by the way, the French already are going to fund a $5,000 workshop in Malaysia to talk about that. And so we're somewhat engaged in the periphery of that through Linwood Pendleton and one of the co-leads of Marine Life 2030, which is Eileen Tan. And we're trying to engage the people in Costa Rica in this process, and they have workshops all the time with stakeholders. But can we put specific ideas that can be funded as little pieces into this co-design proposal that a sponsor can take? I may want to fund this workshop or set of workshops in region X, or across the maybe across some regional alliances. But I'd like to have some feedback on that idea, if we can package it that way. Okay, maybe I should name people and see if they react.
Frank, can I make just a comment to you on that?
Sure.
You mentioned workshops and things like that, but maybe the vision of what's funded and how it works could be expanded. The SCORE working groups have traditionally been relatively low cost, but very effective tools to advance the objectives we have. What if you can work with SCORE or another organization, or create your own, where we're doing missions rather than just sitting at a workshop talking?
Yeah, Jay, let me see if I turn this around, because the SCORE working groups, and I've talked to SCORE about this, SCORE is scientific committee, and they focus on science at a very scientific level. They're not involved in co-design, and they're not interested in a practical application, except maybe by serendipity. So that is, SCORE is not the right vehicle for this. SCORE can help us tie the specs for EOVs if they are approached from a scientific point of view. They're not interested in operations. So we need to find sponsors that are interested in working this from the beginning. So to some extent, Jay, we cannot come in. We have all these best practices to do salinity and seagrass and ocean color, and we want to offer them to you. That's not the way the co-design process is going to work. We have to work, sit down with the local communities. Many of them have very serious social and economic needs, and figure out what they need. I'm more interested in that end of things, like the Malaysia, the Costa Rica, people work in Colombia, and I'm sort of partial to Latin America for kind of obvious reasons. But you know, how do we engage these groups that really have a need? Then we also have to work on the US side, so the developed nations, Europe, as Pierluigi mentioned. I mean, there's an enormous investment in Europe in co-design, in the need for co-design. So maybe that's something that can be planned through the new MBON projects that Pierluigi is involved in, or others, and the same in the US. But so how can we bring developed nations into this, and yet how do we help developing nations, island nations, in this process where I think is tremendous need, and it's an important focus for the decade. And they're not going to come and say, well, we have to build an observing system for you to do this or that, if we don't go talk to them first. Maria?
Yes, so whatever I say now, please take it with a pinch of salt, because this is just me thinking a bit late for my time. But I was also joining the Copernicus workshop for biodiversity today, which, as maybe some of you know, Copernicus, it's a tool that connects data with end users and goes beyond science, but also includes science as well. And there is a discussion, because now it's going to be even stronger on their agenda, how we include biodiversity. There is a strong interest in fisheries, and that comes also from the EU strategy around, like, biodiversity is mostly fisheries, with one sentence somewhere, we care about like carbon sequestration and things. But my understanding is, at least on the EU level, and again, take that with a pinch of salt, is that now, at least I think the Commission is looking for a direction for actions that they can they go towards horizontal actions that can be applied among different Ocean Decade programs, among different Horizon EU funding projects that they came now. And for biodiversity, I know we have 3 already. I don't know how many others there are there. And things that then can be connected with the policy framework and the strategy. So I guess, and the one thing that appeared a lot is data, and maybe it goes back to what Pierre said. Okay, like what kind of biodiversity data are needed for end users and people outside academia, like local communities, small fisheries, aquacultures, what kind of data is useful for them to better understand and monitor biodiversity, and connect that with socioeconomics interactions and activities. So I don't know if because I really liked your idea, Frank, on having small examples. My question is, do you want this to be more homogeneous, like in a specific direction, like, I don't know, seagrass, for example, or do you want that to be diverse? How's that going to be? What is your vision? So it won't look too chaotic, but still has some direction.
I think it's going to look chaotic, Maria. No matter what we do, unless, and maybe we can make small chunks and small proposals, but the proposals are all going to be about working specific end users. Okay, so if we want to work on seagrasses, because I know right now this group in Malaysia is planning with the government to, and so we know them, so it would be a good exemplar to work with. I know that people in Costa Rica have very good linkages with a very large network of small fisheries associations. They lead some of the small fisheries associations that span all of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. and yet it's a small example that we can work with, specifically in Costa Rica, where maybe we can understand how we can address other problems in other places that are similar. You know? So I don't think that we should be restricted to either seagrasses or this small fisheries example. There may be others, and if others can put them into, whenever I come around and share the file with these examples, they should be small and self-contained. I think May Reed told us that right now we shouldn't think about the budget. In this phase, the budget is going to come in later, but we need to have a budget in mind. You know, at the moment, we're not going to construct an observing system. The point is to go work with people on the ground so that they trust what we're trying to do as a mechanism to provide the information that they need to solve a problem. Like in Costa Rica, they need to take information that they're already collecting, but that the government doesn't trust because it's not collected in a scientific manner. So solving their problem, not solving my problem as an observer, solving their problem. And so that's going to take one or two or maybe more discussions with the local people. Because if we don't do that, we have no co-design. We have an imposition of a solution that may or may not work.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, there's many of you involved in many. So Sam is looking at this same problem from an ocean acidification point of view. And Steve is looking at this from a fisheries prediction point of view in the climate context. So all of you are doing something that is relevant, but it has to bring that co-design element up front. Henry, you're working with a DEUCE group and trying to understand how do you advance conservation in the deep sea. That's a very relevant exemplar also. How do we, well, I guess the question is who wants to participate in or in this process with Goose and the co-design effort, or because you have other parallel efforts that you're working on your own anyway. So and this may not be the place for that.
I'm happy to try and align things that are already going. In the example you gave, we're looking to design some data stream planning work for delivering information for the West Coast, but we want it to be like a scalable concept that it could be used elsewhere. So I think we could join things together.
Yeah. I wonder if George Cummings can. George, you're working directly with the kind of communities in the Mesoamerican Reef area that is the kind of group that may need scientific solutions. And I wonder if you can say something about that, the processes that you're involved in.
Well, hey, thanks for asking. I feel like we're so sympathetic on this. We're trying to do the same thing, trying to establish working groups. We identified 50 different areas of working groups. And for a while we could get people to show up because we actually thought UNESCO's funding was going to work. And that gave people hope and excitement, and they were ready to get involved. Because that's all taking so long, it's like we've lost some synergy, energy, whatever you want to call it. But the concept is extremely sympathetic here of that we need to get regional. I just picked out the gyre because to me that's defines ecosystem, and that's the only reason I went that way. And I just said, okay, we've identified like 250 MPAs in the 75 countries. We're just going to try to coordinate everybody. We're going to ask everybody to provide a couple of senators who do they consider their seagrass expert for their country to be a senator to vote on seagrass topics for the North Atlantic ecosystem, and say where are the priorities that we can do the most good, in seagrass for the most people. So whether it's seagrass, turtles, sharks, mangroves, or whatever, that's the model or template or whatever you want to call it that we're trying to do. That's why I was really, I'm excited to see Myriad's slides that sort of has defined that process better than I defined it for our group, for sure. So I get, this is well-intended, passionate people. Maybe some of us are a little we're pretty far out of our comfort zone. That goes back to my thought processes. We need experts to advise those of us that may have, if we have somebody that passionately loves turtles, but they're not a turtle expert, we just need to get those two people working together so that passionate person can contribute, is my big dream, if you will. So I wished I had better insights to that. I mean, I know I've taken all this stuff. We have our seagrass pod, and I just push it to everybody that's in that pod that's saying, okay, throw everything in all Google Docs that's seagrass related. So when we get a working pod that's got at least 30, 40 people showing up that are supposedly the experts from their community, that will have some kind of a cohesive steering committee to say, okay, here's the highest priority seagrass project. Now's time to do seagrass. The media's right. Whatever, when all the variables and the stars align, time to do seagrass in location A, B, or C. That kind of thing is the dream world I see. And I'll popcorn back to you, Frank. Thanks for asking, but I don't think I've got much value. Yeah.
Thank you, George. Sam, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I can try to make a comment from the ORS perspective. And I mean, you also involved, so feel free to correct me if you disagree. But I would say that ORS, or Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability, it's also a UN decade endorsed program, has a focus on ocean acidification and other global changes, including climate change, ocean hypoxia, and some others like this. And it's organized around 7 outcomes. And one of them is really strongly focusing on co-design, exactly what has been described here. So exactly the same philosophy. We need to start with the end users, focus on solution and action, and really prioritize what needs to be done. So I think on that side, we share exactly the same philosophy. The only difference I would say is that in that context, the actions, the solution will require much more than monitoring or observation. So in a way, we are facing a more difficult challenge where I think in some of the case studies that you are mentioning here, observation is definitely the way to go. That's going to be the best evaluation tool for example, testing the efficiency of different strategies. In our case, we're going to have to work with many other approaches like experimentation, modelers, and that's making our job a little bit more complicated because observation won't always be the best way to go. It will be sometimes, but anyway, I think for us, for the community of ORS, I think there is a strong benefit in working with you. I'm not sure it's going to work both ways somehow, but at least I've learned a lot today. I have to confess, I'm really happy I came. I don't have a lot to contribute to, but I'm learning a lot, and I can see connections that can be made. But I was wondering in general to all of you, for some of the questions you want to ask, there will be need for other approaches. So how this community is actually connected to other UN decades that are not necessarily focusing on observation, but other approaches that can be complementary to observation.
I welcome other people to jump into the conversation. Please feel free. Don't be shy.
Frank, I've got a comment. Yeah, I guess, I'm enjoying the discussion, but I guess I'm really struggling in the sense of, there's a couple of things we have to do. We have to outline the scope of whatever co-design activities we want to pursue collectively. We also have to identify potential sponsors and where we might be able to get resources for that. And I honestly don't really know the order in which we need to do those things. Do we have to define the scope, put a proposal together that's very specific and perhaps modest in scope, and then seek sponsorship and support from that? Or or do we try to find, you know, potential sponsors and supporters and then adjust our co-design proposal around that? I guess this is where I'm struggling.
I think we're all in the same boat with you, Steve. I think, and that's the frustration that I think you hear from George, that we all thought that the decade was going to wake up an enormous appetite for these projects and funding would rain from the sky, but it isn't like that. So I think that we probably have to do, you know, all of the above, where we continue to work with individual sponsors the way that we have done research in the past, and try to see how we can fit that in this co-design process. I think, honestly, Steve, and you see that within your own agency, NOAA in the US, there's a shift in thinking in the sponsoring agencies at the government level, in the European community, in the United States, and obviously everywhere else where they have been trying to address very basic needs forever. So that is starting to happen, and there's a lot of emphasis on either broader impacts, and so that's how it started. But now the broader impacts have to be more precisely defined on how do you, what's the impact either on other disciplines or on a socioeconomic point of view. NSF has very big convergence processes, so they call it convergence. Here we call it co-design, but it's exactly the same thing. And so they're investing an enormous amount of money in convergence at NSF to try to address some fundamental things that have to do with coastal oceans and people and other vulnerabilities. NOAA is doing the same thing. MBON intends to do the same thing. So I think that the thinking is coming around to do this, and the decade positions you in a place where you're more visible. But the decade process to sponsorship is opaque to all of us. And so Mayread is helping in a way. Well, this is one channel. If you go through the co-design process and you develop these exemplars, they're going to present them to a set of sponsors, which I have no idea who they are, and I'm not in that group planning that. So we're following instructions to some extent, and see if that can lead to some support. The decade also has these collaborative centers that are intended to connect us to stakeholders, and so we're working that in, and you're working that in too. All of us are working, and all of the levers that we can pull, I think we're pulling, and see if we get the lemons aligned someday. Not a very satisfactory answer, Steve, but I think we have to try every which way possible. And it takes an enormous amount of time, or your time, my time, and yet I think it's worth trying.
Frank, can I just add on that for these proposals, we've outlined a template like for all of the exemplars, and it doesn't have to be a massive, heavy, very detailed proposal at this stage. It's just to put some shape and outline on it, and address some of the key questions that we worked on with the co-chairs for this template, so that we have just an initial outline and proposal to offer when we talk to these supporter groups.
Yeah, Mary, I think November and December is still too soon. It may be, and I don't know how you are going to present, because if I can summarize to the group what you're proposing is you have these phases. The co-design process at Goose has 3 phases. Phase 1, we went through and we had a workshop. We laid out initial ideas. There's 6 potential exemplars. And phase 2 is what we're doing now, is going through conversations on how we plan a proposal. The proposal, my understanding is, should not have a budget at this point. That would come in phase 3. But I think I saw a comment very quickly flash by Pierluigi that sponsors are gonna, if I were a sponsor, the first thing I would ask is, well, how much and for what? Okay, that's the first question. And if I don't get even an outline of a plan, it doesn't have to be long, but something, and how much, then you can't fund it, because you need to scope. Am I going to fund 10 or 1, or is the vast idea matching the vast plan, or is it a half idea with a vast ambition? No? So I'm not sure how at what point Goose is going to start thinking about the budgeting for these exemplars.
I think as part of that phased approach, if there are initial activities identified, then any information about budget estimates will be welcome as part of those proposals.
Yeah, and I think that if I am, let me ask you this, Mary, because at the moment the question is to fund the co-design effort, not the end-to-end value chain from co-design to implementing an observing system, because that could be quite costly depending on what it is that you're proposing.
Yeah, so it's to fund the co-design, the development of the co-design processes, and that's also the reason for needing pilot areas to start. And for example, some of the other exemplars are starting with kind of different levels of pilot areas, so areas that are already well developed, and then others that aren't.
Yeah, so Sam is asking whether in some exemplars observing is not part of the solution. And maybe Sam, you can explain that, what you mean by that.
Fair enough. No, it's more in the context of what we do. For example, if you arrive in a new place where there are no observation at all and you want to start an observing system there, it's going to take decades before you have the quality of the data you need to actually infer anything. So in that case, that's too slow to actually be able to implement changes that are required. So in that case, you might take another approach. I was just thinking if that's an option in the context of what you guys are doing.
I don't really know the answer.
Can I make a comment here? I think that's a really good point, Sam. And coming back to seagrass, there's a lot of interest in distribution of seagrass, very basic data for nationally determined contributions, among other things. And the best way to get that is from satellites, but of course they can't see very far into the water, particularly in turbid water. And so there's a lot of interest in how do you model the distribution of seagrasses in places where you can't see it. And so I think in that sense, for addressing the user requirements and questions, we do need more than observations oftentimes in places where there's no capacity or no infrastructure and no hope of building that in less than a decade. But I also wanted to make a comment. We've had a lot of discussion about the challenges of doing these big systems, and I wonder if part of the issue is our focus on system. What we're really, I think what we're talking about is, providing scientific data that is useful to people. And there are lots of different ways to do that and parts of that value chain, if you will. And so, for example, what I was talking about with the seagrass example is we're simply trying to make it easy to understand how to collect these data if you need them, so that parties who actually need seagrass data have some guidance on how to do it. And that's not entirely pie in the sky. There are a lot of countries and entities that are very interested in mapping their seagrass. I think of the Allen Coral Atlas, which was just, a worldwide, I should say, had the aim of doing a worldwide map of coral abundance, and that's being used in conservation. I don't know how much co-design was done with that. Chris Rolfsema at University of Queensland has been pushing with me and several others the idea of doing a similar kind of map for seagrasses. And I think that there are a lot of ways that could be used. And we're not attempting to create an entire system. We just want to produce a resource that will be open access and useful for a variety of purposes. So in other words, it only gets at part of that system, but I think could be useful anyway.
Let me turn the question around George, go ahead.
I just wanted to really support what Frank said. I think, we're facing 100 years of bad behaviors and 127 ocean health index factors that we've looked at and know how bad they've gotten. So it's this long accumulation of behaviors of everybody that's been born and died since then to now. So we can't leave any stressor focus area untouched, and every viable good or best practice that we know today being pursued to make micro improvements to some of those 127 stressors. So I'm just with Frank. It's just, we gotta, there's no silver bullets. I know all of these are platitudes, but we gotta chip away at all this stuff simultaneously in the right order. That's my other big fear, that we get some stuff too far ahead. I just use the ocean media for life right now is really not a life supporting media, or it's certainly not going to be much longer. And so we got to get that straightened up. And we all know it's CO2, blah, blah, blah. So, but if we ended all the CO2 tomorrow, it wouldn't fix the problem. We'd still have the other 120 factors hitting us in the face. So I just wanted to support Frank's thing. We've got to be more comprehensive and simultaneous with proper priorities. And I hope that's what comes out of the UNESCO Best Practices Committee, if you will, and this group, that we're just really closely watching the limited until we get resources. It's still a world of very limited resources, and by God, we better not waste any of them. And we have no time for redos. We have no time to make bigger mistakes than we are making solutions. So that's which is it's like we need to rush to make improvements, but yet we need to be very cautious that we aren't doing something out of time that we just wasted human and physical resources because we did it the wrong time in our rush to passionately do something, to feel like we're doing something. Just because we need to do that doesn't mean it's the right time or place to do it. I'll shut up again, and back to you, Frank.
Thanks, George. Well, we certainly want to go beyond just feeling that we're doing something and actually find a way to apply all the knowledge that sits around this table to solve actual problems. And so that's why I think finding these communities where a change has to happen is important. And in countries like in the US, where things are very organized, maybe we can contribute, because I think one thing that is very disorganized is the way that we collect biological observations. So I think that there's a niche there, and I think we're working with elements at NOAA to try to organize that, and it's an uphill battle even in this country. But in other communities in a developing nation and island nations. The problems are enormous. They're very different everywhere you go. And so it's not going to be one bullet for all of them. It's going to be one by one, maybe. And there may be ways to replicate a solution across other countries. So maybe one of the things that I have hope in working with OARS and the ocean acidification group is, I mean, I think that you have established an incredible network with the ocean acidification ocean observing group, the GOA on. And I think that many of them that you're engaging in Africa and in Latin America or in all of the Americas are either groups that are interested from a scientific point of view, but some may also be interested in understanding why is ocean acidification changing, how is it changing, and what are the impacts. There, pairing up those observations with the right biological observations may be useful. And so I'm trying to learn by working with you, is that happening? Where is it happening? And are there things that we can do to bring the biological observing in this best practice context that we're talking about, with the right approach, convergence, with the data formatting standards that we're talking about for all these different approaches from acoustics to eDNA, to bring that to the table to see if that can solve their problem. But for that, we need to know who is already collecting ocean acidification data and what are they doing? Do they even need our help, or do we focus someplace else? And that's my interest in working with a group like OARS, to understand what are other people doing where. And so, Sam, I don't know if you have examples of groups that are collecting pH or dissolving organic carbon, but they are not measuring biology. I think that there's a lot of
No, you're right. I think that's one of the things that actually why we contact. I think you were contacted through OARS too, is because we are missing expertise on that side, like how to reconcile the different existing data. So places where you have biological monitoring but not chemical monitoring, the other way around, and places where you have both. We can learn a lot from all of that. So that I really like this community of acidification, in the sense that it's really well organized and really open-minded, and we are really eager to learn from the different other communities. And I'm pretty sure there will be some great job. On the other hand, I understand George's frustration. I agree with him that, it's time to act, and it can be frustrating to realize that we always talk about what we're going to do, and we are doing things, but maybe not fast enough. And I have to say, I'm teaching a lot in different developing countries about acidification, but I try not to overstep the importance of it. So one of the first things I do when I arrive there is like, you were here because you're interested in acidification, but that might not be the most important thing for you. And it's likely that today it's not the bigger issue. So I always ask them to first think locally and what are the main issues that need to be addressed. And then in the spirit of co-design, try to find, okay, if the main issues is overfishing, overwhelmingly more important than acidification, climate change, and other thing, that's maybe what you should first focus on. And then doesn't mean the other one are less important, but they might be less important now. So it's a multi-stressor world now, and that's the first thing to do, is really to, when you work with a niche, an ecosystem in a region, is really to identify the main stressors, the associated solution, the timeline of the solutions, and then what kind of data are limiting the implementation of this solution. That's where we enter. It's basically how can we contribute to speed up the process, implement the solution, and so on. But it's complicated, of course.
Yeah, I think we have to start wrapping up. One thing that I had requested is to somehow let people should let me know if they want to get into the next phase with me on these Goose co-design proposals. And I asked that people identify by putting an asterisk next to your name in the table of names, or somehow write it into the chat, and I'll try to find it later on. But please tell me, so that I don't, because otherwise I don't know who wants to be involved.
Frank, you prefer that in the chat, or you want us to put it in that notes document?
And in the notes document, there's a table of names. I hope everybody put their name in.
So if we put our name there, you're going to send that to us already. I'm just being clear.
Yeah,
I've already put my name there. Okay, all right.
no, but I want a star next to your name if you're interested in the co-design
Oh yeah.
proposal.
Okay, that's what I missed. Okay.
Because I don't want to email you if you're not interested. So as we wrap up, I don't know if Jay, if you're still there, if you want to bring this back to the purpose of this workshop in the co-design sense.
I'd just like to say that the co-design that you're working with the Decade Office and with the teams here is an important part of getting specific projects that are successful. And I'd like to come back to the workshop in the sense that developing the practices to propagate those once we have a demonstration to make them real for people out in the field is a very, very high priority. And this work in best practices runs across many value chains, if you want to call it that, although I defer to Pierluigi to define that. And I would suggest that we look at that as a follow-on to this. Thank you.
Very good. Yeah, I think Jay made a comment. I think Pierluigi asked before, well, how do we define the value chain? And that is a parallel discussion. There's many different ways to define a value chain. And the Goose co-design process is asking us to do that for this exemplar. And I've been working with Steve Bograd because Steve borrowed an outline. It's kind of a schematic of a value chain that I've seen in other places. Like Goose itself, in its 2030 strategy, has something that looks like the symbol of infinity, which is kind of a Mobius strip. But in the Goose strategy, they have like 4 or 5 bubbles. And Steve has a Mobius strip with 3 bubbles, in which they have, you have the end users, you have the observing system, and you have a factory of solutions, which is a little bit high level, but I'm using that to break out the groups that we would need in every bubble at every level of geography, like at the local level, regional level, and global level. So, and every one application of this co-design process will have its own stakeholders. So I don't think that you can just list them all, or you would have an enormous laundry list that is completely useless. So I think that every case needs to be dissected. So when you talk to the right people, you bring the right people in to work on a solution and deliver a solution. And how do we illustrate the value chain graphically is going to depend on every group. The business community has a complicated value chain that I tried to design one and presented it. And I think that Christian, I don't know if you were the one that developed one for the best practices, or I'm not sure who here, but I've seen that before. Is that what we want? I don't know. Maybe once you see the proposal and you see the very simplistic value chain that I put in, that I copied from Supreme, and they're copying it from the Climate and Fisheries program, maybe you'll see why it's not that simple, but it may be useful as a visual. Any comments on this issue of a value chain, Pierluigi or Steve?
Some comments in the chat. Indeed, value chain analysis is a real thing, but often in academia, we tend to sort of draw cartoons in papers and call it a value chain. And we have to move past that because, you have to identify what the value is, who receives that value, who are the consumers of the thing you're developing, and who are not. That's really important. Because, a lot of our programs and things talk about the care principles and, indigenous data and indigenous rights. Increasing the value proposition for certain stakeholders, extractive industry, etc., can decrease value for others, local communities, So it's time to get serious about that and, a little bit less idealistic. Indeed, Christian and his team and I, we put together using the Porter value chain analysis, a value chain for the OBPS. Here's the link from last workshop. And, you can do it to identify really the activities that support something, that support the value generating activities, input activities, enrichment, and then output. And you identify what your value is. Now, again, we get past that idea that there's only one value chain. And I think that's going to help things like co-design to say, okay, for this process that we're co-designing right now, what is the value that is being generated at each step for each partner? Who receives that value and who doesn't, right? Then we get a much more sort of clear view and a real pragmatic view on what's happening, like what's really happening when we release scientific data into the open that can help some people and it can harm others. And we will never know that unless we talk to those communities, as we said before, right? And, kind of get real about things. Then I think people will take academics a bit more seriously when they sort of parachute in and say, look, we're here to help. Is that, what is it? Man from the government, I'm here to help, never trust,
Yeah. Run for the hills, right? Yeah, I mean, I actually put one of these Porter models for our exemplar, but the Goose Co-Design group, I don't think they liked it very much, and so they were thinking about something else. But
yeah, a lot of people have a negative reaction to it because you're getting specific about things. Yeah. It's time we get specific about things.
Well, I have it in the back pocket. Maybe we'll use it at some point. But at this point, they wanted something simple that can be presented to sponsors.
Sure.
So anyway,
yeah, exactly. And call that whatever you need to, like the value flow, something. There's a bunch of things to loosen the idea. But let's not overmarket something that isn't precise and say, okay, this is what we think is the general flow for these stakeholders. That could be the observing community or whatever. And then we can get more specific, and then we have a plan. Structuring the process and saying we're going to deepen and add more detail when we do the co-design, I think is a very mature position to take. It's like we've identified this general direction, this orientation, but we have to talk to the communities to get specific about things and then actually generate value chains. If we do that, then a funder has something to fund, right? You have a deliverable to say, we want to build a value chain, but we need to talk to these people to do it. Please fund the meeting.
Right. I talked to the people in Costa Rica, and they developed their own value chain that goes from the local community that does traditional artisanal fishing to the packing station to the market in the capital. And so that's they actually have a very good idea of how does the fish flow to provide value back to the community. And it's different from what we're thinking. So it really has it's very context specific. Anyway, we're wrapping up here. I think that I hope that this was useful. It was useful to me to think about exactly who wants to be involved in this co-design process moving forward. And I promise that I will put together one of these documents with these embedded exemplars at different geographic levels. And hopefully it'll be useful to some of us as we move into the decade. Anybody wants to say anything to close up? Any last questions?
Frank, I just want to say thanks for leading the charge and the others who organized the session.
Yeah, I want to thank Caitlin Lang, who's at NOAA. She's actually the one that kind of poked us to get this organized, and Douglas Rao for standing also as a fellow at NOAA to push this forward, and hopefully they'll help us to move this to the next level also. And thanks everybody for being here. And so let's close it up. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Frank, I copied the chat into the notes document. So if there's any
Perfect.
information you need, you can get it.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you.